Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Native Farm Bill Coalition webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to take a second to welcome and introduce everyone. Today, we will be joined by the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Sioux Tribe, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative out of the University of Arkansas. And my name is Maria Givens. I'm a member of the Coeur d'Alene Tribe, and I'm a policy analyst for NCAI. And I'll be moderating today's session. So thank you for joining us. First, we'd like to talk about the Regaining Our Future report. Chris?
Good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be, everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar. We want to take just a few moments to talk about the Native Farm Bill Coalition, what led to its creation, for the benefit of those of you in particular who did not have an opportunity to participate in the webinar that was held 3 weeks ago. Just very quickly, the Native Farm Bill Coalition came about as a result of a report which was commissioned by the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Sioux community over a year ago. After the 2016 elections, it became quite clear that there were both opportunities but a number of potential threats to the interests of Indian country in the upcoming 2018 Farm Bill Congressional deliberations. That led the Shakopee tribe, which has been working with a number of partners over the last several years to improve Native American nutrition, to commission a report about what those risks and opportunities that lay ahead. We worked very, very closely with the National Congress of American Indians, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the Intertribal Timber Council, and with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and its director, Janie Sims-Hip, and its policy director, Colby Duran, both of whom you will be hearing from in a few minutes. Janie and Colby authored the report, which was released last summer. That report, which you have an opportunity to download for free at the nativefarmbillcoalition.org website, is a very detailed, the most exhaustive, detailed analysis of the interests of Indian country in the Farm Bill. The initial reaction from a number of tribal leaders, from allies in Congress and others, was that this document was extremely important. And the reception was so positive that it led to the next natural question, which is, what can Indian country do to better organize itself and to adopt a more unified position heading into the work of assembling the 2018 Farm Bill. So the Shakopee and Mdewakanton Sioux community has been grateful to work with NCAI, with the Intertribal Ag Council, and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, not only in the report, which has led to the creation of the coalition itself, but also now to helping to organize this coalition. And to talk a little bit more about the coalition and its purposes, I want to introduce the co-chair of the Native Farm Bill Coalition, Ross Racine, the executive director of the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Ross.
Thank you. The Intertribal Ag Council has had a long history of working on farm bills, dating back to its inception in 1987. And this coalition represents the first time Indian country has put forth a coordinated and cohesive effort to ensure that Indian country protects the progress that we've made to date and enhances opportunities in this bill in the future. I want to thank the 32 tribes that have passed their resolutions to date, and I want to encourage those tribes that have not passed a resolution of support to do so soon. I want to remind you that there is no financial obligation for becoming a member of this coalition, but the more tribes that we can have supporting our efforts, the greater the chance of success as we move forward working on this farm bill. Thank you for the opportunity. Maria?
Thank you, Ross. And if you're looking to join the Native Farm Bill Coalition, if your tribe has passed a resolution, if you could email that resolution to info@nativefarmbillcoalition.org. And there is a whole lot of information on our website, www.nativefarmbillcoalition.org. And I also wanted to let everyone know about the future events that are coming up. Our previous event was our last webinar on December 18th, focusing on nutrition. In that webinar, we have it posted up to NCAI's YouTube channel, and it's also on the website. And in case you missed it, you can watch it there, and that link will be up forever. So if you need to share it or let some folks know within your tribe who might be interested, that would be great if you could send that along. Our next webinar is going to be on January 29th, and it's going to focus on economic development, credit, and rural development. And then in February, from February 12th through the 15th in Washington, D.C., NCAI will be hosting its Executive Council Winter Session. This is NCAI's most policy-driven conference, and Farm Bill is going to be a big issue at this conference. And we host a lot of members of Congress, agency officials who want to continue their government-to-government relationship with Indian tribes. So we definitely encourage you and your tribal leaders out there to come join us in February. There will be a Farm Bill session hosted by the coalition, and there is also the opportunity and the time allotted for folks to go on the Hill and actually meet with their members of Congress and tell them why the Farm Bill is so important for Indian country, and to highlight the opportunities to really advance our communities. So we really hope that you'll join us again January 29th for our next webinar, and in February, the 12th through the 15th in Washington, D.C. for NCAI. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Janie Sims-Hipp and Colby Duran with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative.
Hi, thank you very much, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the Policy Director and one of the staff attorneys at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We're based out of the University of Arkansas School of Law. Our director, Janie Sims-Hipp, will be joining us a little later to talk about some of the other sections. But just to start out the discussion, and for those of you who joined us on our first webinar, this will be a little bit of review, but to just kind of go over about the Farm Bill generally to get a general sense of where it is and kind of where it can go. So there's really no other apt way to be able to put the Farm Bill that we've been able to find than the last time it was passed in 2014. Since it's a 5-year bill by President Obama, as it's really a Swiss Army knife, and it's something that has something in it for potentially all of the country. It has a health and nutrition component. It also has research and educational opportunities. There's also a lot of opportunities for jobs, being able to build out infrastructure, particularly in rural communities and in tribal communities, conservation, which we'll be talking a lot about today, some of the more innovation focused things, including energy, and it also provides a safety net for a lot of farm programs and farmers. So if you can please go to the next slide. So as I said, the Farm Bill is a 5-year bill. It's a bill that has to be reauthorized every 5 years. It's not one of those pieces of legislation that will continue on once it sort of expires. There's actually what's called the dairy cliff that forces Congress to be able to, or to actually get together and pass either to extend the programs out or to be able to push it on. So we do know that there will definitely be action in Congress on the Farm Bill coming up in this session, because by the end of the year, September 18, 2018, they're going to have to take some type of action. So this 5-year bill, as it was last passed, was a $489 billion bill. The Farm Bill is the second largest non-defense funding bill that Congress passes, and it has a very strong rural focus. And so what you can see from the funding breakdown on that chart is that nutrition does carry the day, and that's the SNAP program, which also includes the food distribution program on Indian reservations. And the SNAP program was sort of the retitled food stamp program. So that's where a lot of the funding is, and that's where some of the most contention is in that, and that'll probably be continue on in this 2018 Farm Bill discussion. But I also want to highlight the third largest funding bucket, which is also conservation, which we're going to be talking about in depth today too. That carries a large portion of funding as well, and something that does come up in discussions regarding conservation programs, how they're funded, and whether the funding should be extended or decreased based upon that. So that's sort of a little bit of the lay of the land for that. If you can go to the next slide, Maria. So why does the Farm Bill matter? Well, when Congress looks to pass any legislation, the Congressional Budget Office weighs in and takes a look at its impact on the federal budget over a 10-year period. And the last time it was passed, in 2014, Congress said it would have a $956 billion impact on it. And we do know that this is as one of the only truly rural development focused pieces of legislation that can do things, not only just food and agriculture and nutrition, but also infrastructure, housing, community buildings, education, broadband, and utilities. It's something that can be very, very important for any country to have additional access to. So when we're looking at what type of impact the 2018 Farm Bill could have, it can have potentially a $1 trillion impact to Indian country and to rural areas over the next 10-year period. So we're in a very critical moment to be able to see what's the best way to try to get some additional access to these programs and make these programs help support tribal governments and also tribal food producers. So with that, please go to the next slide. The Farm Bill is broken down into 12 titles. Don't worry, there won't be a quiz question at the end of this webinar quizzing you on what all 12 of them are. But as you can see, they can cover a pretty broad swath and array of different types of programs. And so how we try to talk about them is because a lot of them have to function separately, but there's a lot of crossover on how they're also woven together to be able to work really well to support producers. So if you go to the next slide, we actually break it down into 5 key areas. And so there's opportunities for business and economic development, infrastructure and community development, natural resources and conservation, which will be the focus today, and nutrition and health, and then also miscellaneous. And so as this, and our third topic for today is traditional foods is woven throughout a lot of these, but does have a strong base in some of the conservation and forestry programs. So with that, I think we can go on to the next slide and to the next presenter. I think I'm handing it back over to Maria.
Thanks, Colby. That was a great Farm Bill 101. And so we're seeing a lot happening in Congress, and I wanted to turn it over to Phil Bakershank to give us an update about what's happening on the Hill.
Sure. Thank you, Maria. I do some work for Shakopee and now through them this coalition. As many of you know from reading the papers, the Farm Bill debate is going to be highly politicized this year given the election year dynamics and the House and Senate being up for grabs and some uncertainty about the strength and reach of the administration. So all of that will play out in our bill and our efforts to get into this bill with Indian country provisions that are friendly to our interests. Those dynamics are likely going to mean that the committees will be telling us and others that they are on a very fast track to get a bill up and out early in the first quarter of this year. We're hearing that message. We've been hearing that same fire alarm call for some months now. And it's very possible they could come to an agreement and move very quickly. But in any event, this is very likely the first 7 months of the year or pushed into 2019. The political issues, of course, involve spending levels. Much of the money is so-called entitlement or mandatory spending, mostly through SNAP. And there's a strong push by deficit cutters to diminish, contain, constrain that spending. And the latest idea you see played out on the front pages is to block grant the whole program at a discounted cost to the state governments. That, of course, is a non-starter for Indian country. We've been to that rodeo before. We know how that ends. This is a huge challenge for Indian country to preserve the government-to-government relationship and actually make it work. The other thing you'll see in the papers is a work requirement is being talked about. This, of course, works only where there are jobs to work on, and much of Indian country is in high unemployment areas. So there again, some of the so-called solutions actually would cause even more problems for Indian country. So we have a huge challenge on the nutrition and spending side of this bill, but there are plenty of opportunities, both through self-determination, self-governance, 638, and through parity arguments. And lastly, one underdeveloped area for Indian country has been infrastructure in rural America, which we're going to talk about later today and also in future webinars. And that, of course, is the priority of the Trump administration this week, and perhaps beyond this week, may take some reality in the farm bill that they support. So that is that's the political kind of picture. Maria has some additional detail on that and on the upcoming hearing.
Thanks, Phil. That's a great update. One of the biggest pieces of news regarding Indian affairs that has come out since the new year about the Farm Bill is that the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs is going to hold a hearing on agribusiness next week, January 17th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you happen to know someone from your tribe or you yourself will be in Washington, D.C., it'll be good to head over there and see what's happening for the hearing. And it'll also be usually as webcast from the committee's website. This is really important because this might be Indian country's only shot to get something in for the record for the Farm Bill. NCAI is encouraging all tribes to submit testimony to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, highlighting your priorities for your tribe and the importance of including Indian country in this huge piece of legislation. Phil mentioned 638 contracts and tribal parity, and really at the end of the day, tribes need to be treated just as states are, and especially within USDA. And 638 contracts have been working really well with the Department of Interior and through IHS, and so we really want to expand this to the USDA. And so we're really, really encouraging folks to submit testimony to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. You'll have 2 weeks after the 17th, so I believe that's the 30th, after the hearing to be able to submit testimony. And we'll have a slide at the end of this to remind everyone of what they can do next. And then also just one little thing that I forgot to mention, if you're having any troubles or if you know someone who wants to watch this webinar later, it will be posted to YouTube shortly after the webinar is concluded. So it'll be out there to share and to rewatch in case you missed a piece of the details through all of this. So next, I think we're going to get into the meat of the webinar and start learning about conservation from the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative.
Hi, thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. It's Colby again. So I'll go over some of the basics of the conservation title and some of the conservation programs, and I'll be happy to answer, I think, any questions that may come up about it at the end of the webinar. So as I mentioned earlier, conservation, even though it makes up about 6% of the overall funding, which is actually the third largest bucket of funding for the Farm Bill, it actually was one of the primary purposes of the original Farm Bill legislation, which came out in the 30s around the Dust Bowl era, to be able to protect lands and be able to protect farmers so that they can ensure crop production, particularly during the Great Depression time. A lot of the different stuff that the conservation programs does is really create cost share programs that allow farmers to be able to address habitat issues, any type of soil erosion, or other resource conservation that needs to happen, or to be able to protect from extreme weather conditions. Even though it was a central part of the Farm Bill itself, it wasn't actually a title of the Farm Bill until about 1985 is when it became an actual name title of it. Sort of since that time, it really grew and expanded, and there were going into the debate of at the time was the 2012 Farm Bill, there were 26 different conservation programs at USDA. A lot of those were regional programs that had their own focus on particular watersheds, for example, in Chesapeake and the Great Lakes and a few other areas. But when they took a look at what became the 2014 Farm Bill, they ended up consolidating a lot of those programs together, and they dropped that number in half to 13 total conservation programs. And so they actually ended up cutting the funding for it. One of the things they also did, and this is something that will probably come up in the Farm Bill debate, particularly on the House side, is one of the conservation, the resource conservation program or conservation resource program. There's a set number of acres that can be taken out of production underneath that, and so they actually limited that from 32 million acres, and that's for the entire country, down to 24 million acres, and that ended up being an incredible cost savings overall, because that ends up being a cost share or payments for the government to install for government to provide producers to install conservation measures on lands. And one of the things we do know is that there is interest in the House to be able to raise up that number of acres back to at least 32 million again, which would represent an actual increase in funding. And so that's something to keep an eye out for when we're talking about conservation. Is there's the thought that there's no more new money, but there is interest in trying to find ways to expand conservation programs. And conservation programs, because they're so critical and core to the main purpose of the farm legislation and Farm Bill itself, that conservation programs are actually necessary to enter into if any producer wants to receive crop insurance or sometimes enter into other Farm Service Agency programs that USDA has. So conservation is typically at the forefront and center for a lot of the stuff USDA does and some of the programs they administer. If you can go to the next slide, please. So its importance to Indian country, a lot of the federal conservation programs have really bypassed much of the land in Indian country. And a lot of this really kind of has to do with some of the jurisdictional issues and components that tribal lands have, where you might be a producer, but you're producing on tribal land. And so then you have another jurisdiction coming in with the Department of the Interior and Bureau of Indian Affairs, or if you have leased out land at BLM or any of the other agencies that oversee lands that Native producers might be on. So a lot of times, some of these producers don't get sort of the parity of access to these programs because the agencies aren't speaking the same language or the programs aren't really matching up. So one of the things that we can see to be able to improve these conservation programs in Indian country is to be able to ensure that there's greater tribal flexibility in them, so that they recognize the difference in some of these land status and issues, and that they're able to really maximize the programs for that different type of status. And to be able to do that, we really need to be able to have strong coordination between the USDA and BIA to be able to improve this, because without those two agencies talking together and being able to get on the same page for how programs are administered, how programs are funded, what are the different requirements for entering into those programs and matching up those requirements, the program simply will not work. I think probably one of the best examples of being able to showcase where some of the issues lie in this is typically for some of the conservation programs at USDA. They require you to provide a 30-year easement, a conservation easement, to allow a conservation practice on your land. Now, some of BIA's statutory authority only allows for a 25-year easement. So just instead of that, those numbers don't end up matching up, and it's simply almost a function of statute and regulation. But those are the kind of different things that can cause little hiccups that coordination that can actually address. Additionally, some of the different things that can also be improved in this, and this is something that we know that a lot of the regional folks at the National Resources Conservation Service are doing in their areas, but I think being able to kind of codify that work and really memorialize it is to have a really deep incorporation of the traditional ecological knowledge conservation practices that tribal producers are doing in their areas, to be able to make sure that those are recognized as conservation practices for USDA programs, because sometimes that's not happening. So there may be a practice which tribal producers have been doing since time immemorial, but it may not be something that is fully recognized by NRCS. And so we want to make sure that they have the authority or ability to be able to say that, yes, that's a practice that we can now approve for our programs, and to be able to use that. So if you can go to the next slide. So here's a look at some of the programs that are in the conservation title, and get an example of sort of their initial impact. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is really a program that kind of leverages different groups to be able to work together at the tribal, state, and local levels. As you can see, about $27 million of that program went to projects where tribes were the lead. For Conservation Stewardship Program, it's a program that's existed for quite a while, so some of you are probably familiar with it. What we do know is when the funding for that was increased in FY 2010 through 11, tribal participation went up by 172%, with over 246 contracts going directly to tribes. And even though that number went up so high, that only represented about $10.4 million of that program. For the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is another one a lot of you might be familiar with, it's really about being able to get payments to install conservation practices or cost share. It's something that is not only used just for farming and ranching, but is also can be used in forest lands. And so we do know that there are Alaska Native tribes that do enter these programs for protection of some of the different of their forest resources that they may either own or manage. But we do know that there's been, in 2005, 632 EQIP contracts that's worth about $25 million. In 2015, there's been 5 regional conservation partnership projects, 339 conservation stewardship program contracts, and then 2 agriculture management assistant contracts. And so, even though some of these numbers are pretty good in size, we're really sort of at just sort of the real tip of the iceberg here on what can be done if you start to be able to leverage the program authorities and to be able to improve access to these programs and improve the ability to enter them through some of the parity discussions and trying to change those. So if you can go to the next slide, Maria. Here's just to show an example of the impact of regionally where some of the conservation money goes. In the Conservation Stewardship Program, you can see a lot of that is sort of focused in the center of the country, with just a smaller amount sort of going to the folks in Alaska and the Northeast. But this is kind of a little bit of the layout of where those dollars kind of go. And if you go to the next slide. Next slide, with the Connect Tribal Council, this shows sort of the tribal and traditional conservation districts that they've been able to establish through some USDA programs, and you can kind of see where they're spread out and some of the focuses are. And one of the things I think that this map really highlights, and I think is a really important point with the conservation title overall, is there is a really there is, particularly from us as a coalition, and I think overall, particularly in Congress and at the USDA, there's really a great need for further input from Alaska Native tribes and Alaska Native producers on how to be able to modify these conservation programs to further protect some of the interest, and that's particularly with the traditional and customary lifeways and the native subsistence lifestyles that many folks in there continue on with, and to be able to try to protect natural resources for that. And so we think that there's a lot you can be able to do to expand these out in Alaska to help with that. So I think that's one thing. If there are folks on this call and the webinar, folks that you all know that have ideas of how to be able to improve the access to these programs, please let us know. We'd love to be able to talk with you all and work with you on that. So if you can go to the next slide. Here's another regional example of where the Regional Conservation Partnership Program is. You can see that there's a very heavy focus in the west and northwest, and a little bit in the southeast, and it kind of gets a sense of where these different programs break out. And some of them have some of them have stronger regional representation than others. And Maria, if you can go to the next slide. Here's another one about the change in the CRP program. Now, this is the one that they're looking at potentially expanding again, but would cost money. And then you can kind of see where some of the lands are with that. Again, focused more in the center part of the country, and then up towards Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And please go to the next slide. So what are some of the different opportunities for Indian country in the conservation title? I think we see this as really one of the greatest titles for parity overall. And that not only includes in areas where there's state authority, so there's language throughout that allow deference to states and to be able to include states in programs. And I think the ability to be able to add tribal governments and tribal nations within that are very important. And I think, but in addition to that, there's also deference to state law. And so we want to make sure there's any reference to state laws in there, that there's also a reference to tribal law, so that when tribes have their own laws and codes on conservation practices, that they're able to make sure that those are something that are recognized by USDA. As we talked a lot about some of the different parity components, we want to make sure that there's an equivalent status between USDA and BIA conservation plans and conservation management plans, as sometimes, as I said before, they don't quite speak up or add up the same way. We also want to make sure that traditional ecological knowledge-based conservation practices are recognized by the National Resource Conservation Service as proper conservation practices, so that traditional producers or producers that are using those traditional practices are able to enter into programs using them. Further, the Conservation Resource Program, that land retirement program, there's ways to be able to leverage that land that's taken out of production to actually continue the conservation practices on it, but then also make it available for beginning tribal farmers and ranchers to start producing in ways that won't harm the land. So we want to make sure that beginning tribal farmers and ranchers can have access to the CRP land. We want to make sure that tribal priorities are included in any resource concerns definition that USDA puts out regarding the protection of resources, and also want to make sure that lands held in common by multiple folks or lands held by tribal entities also have access to conservation programs, addressing some of the issues of fractionalization and how it might make it hard to be able to access those programs by not getting everybody who has an interest in it signing off on a conservation practice. Talked about tribal lands wanting priority enrollment in the CRP program to retire those lands out of production. They also have greater transparency regarding conservation projects funded on tribal lands, and further trying to get state conservation, whether anytime there's a state conservationist or a state conservation committee, we want to make sure there's a tribal technical committee or there's tribal representatives on those programs to be able to speak about some of the issues that are happening in their communities in their areas. And then one of the things we've also talked about is trying to get additional conservation measures and protections, particularly for fisheries. And this is one way that we've seen in some areas where tribes have had very good success using some of the existing conservation programs to be able to work with farmers in the areas that have access to water to not only just use less of the resource, but use the resource in a way that actually helps and benefits the health of the water in the river, and particularly the salmon and the other fish that are in there as well. So that folks that are fishing that are hunting or gathering in there, that those areas are actually being supported through the USDA conservation programs, and folks that can still access their traditional foods, and that's actually brought back sometimes the health of fish in areas where those populations have gone down. So with that, I think that's all for the conservation title, and I think we'll keep going on to the forestry title. So if you can go to the next slide, Maria. So forestry is the little-known office at USDA. They even keep it across the street from USDA, but it became a Farm Bill title in 2002, and it sets out the priorities, planning, standards, and cooperative relationships between federal, state, tribal, and private forest systems. And I think some of the things to really underscore here, as a lot of you and all of you pretty much know, there's federal forestry and federal forestry protections and programs can be critically important, as a lot of those areas represent areas that are traditional tribal homelands. And so they have not only cultural resources, but also medicinal and traditional food resources on them. So being able to protect and to be able to access them are critically important. Within Indian country, Indian forests and woodlands comprise about 18.6 million acres of the 57 million acres of Indian land, which is held in trust. And so that's about a third overall. There's more than 300 tribes that have forests and that also have woodlands. And we know from using the statistics from the folks at the Intertribal Timber Council that that forestry revenue itself brings in about $40 million to tribal governments and represents over 19,000 jobs in and around tribal communities. So there's a very important, they represent a very important not only revenue stream, but also job creation stream and also protection and management stream. One of the things that we'll talk sort of directly is that one of the larger issues overall in forestry has been wildfire issues. And that's something that is going to maybe potentially be addressed by the Farm Bill, but Congress does need to do something to address wildfire funding issues, as USDA programs essentially end up having to they have to use other funding authorities to pay for wildfire fighting. And so they end up getting that money back at the end of it, but sometimes those programs are essentially not able to work because they're having to pull money out of other places and other pots to actually fight fires. So we want to make sure in a lot of those programs that there's a priority, particularly for tribal forests, to have funding to fight wildfires. So if you can go to the next slide, Maria. As you can see, this map shows areas where there's significant timber resources in Indian country, and you can see there's a lot of it located in the southeast part of Alaska, all the way down through Juneau on the way up, particularly in the northwest area, all the way out to Montana, out into Minnesota, and then as you go farther down out into the Four Corners area and Arizona and New Mexico. So a lot of it's focused on places on west of the Mississippi, but there's a lot of different areas, and this is where some of the large bulk of the land is. But there's also wild forest lands for the tribes in Maine, and also on down into North Carolina as well, and in Oklahoma. So it is a pretty good regional representation as well. If you can go to the next slide. Here's sort of the breakdown of where Indian Forest trust land is, how it's classified. You can get an idea. So this sort of shows where there's commercial timber. Of the 18.6 million acres of woodlands, about 7.3 million acres is commercial forestry. And so you can see the breakdown of where the commercial timber is on there, and then where there's non-commercial timber, then commercial woodland, and then non-commercial woodland. You can get a sense of almost regionally where that's broken out, how there is a lot of how there's a lot of it sort of particularly in the Southwest, with just some of the size of the woodland and timber areas. And if you go to the next slide. And the next slide shows some of the issues for tribes for forestry and fire funding. And this is from the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team report that came out in 2013. It's something that's done by the Intertribal Timber Council at the request of Congress every 10 years. And it takes an assessment looking at what are some of the forestry issues and funding issues. And so one of the things you're able to really see in this is sort of some of the gaps in funding. And now this is from 2011, but being able to see that there's about really almost a $100 million gap between what was needed, particularly at that time, to be able to fight forest fires versus what was available. And just because of how much forest fires have grown exponentially and particularly their devastative impacts, we do know that that number has drastically increased. I mean, just in 2015 alone, over 400,000 acres of just the Northwest tribal forestry lands were burned. And that number has continued to grow. And as everyone's seen a lot of the reports of wildfires, you may be experiencing that in your own communities as well. So if you go to the next slide, Maria. So what are some of the opportunities that exist in the Forestry Title? First, there's the ability to streamline the Tribal Forestry Protection Act provisions to be able to improve the review timelines for those and to be able to implement some of the restoration projects. Also, we've heard that tribes are asking to be added to the Good Neighbor Authority so that they're able to enter into agreements with USDA under that authority and states under that authority to be able to manage forest lands. As I mentioned earlier, fixing the wildfire funding issue, that's a fix that needs to be done overall. And I do know that that's something that has broad bipartisan support in Congress and will hopefully be something that could be addressed with the Farm Bill, if not could be done through another mechanism. Further, we want to be able to change the name of the program to the Federal Tribal State and Private Forestry Program to recognize tribal forests on that same level, as they're simply not included just even in the title and function of that program. We also want to allow for a greater tribal cooperative management of adjacent federal forests, support the next generation of tribal forestry workforce to be able to build out those that are looking to enter into that industry, have McIntyre-Stenson Act parity for tribal colleges and universities, create an anchor forest program, project/program, protect sacred places located on Forest Service lands, require more tribal representation on Forest Service bodies, and then again create parity between the Forest Service language and also the Natural Resource Conservation Service land control language. And being able to do so will not only help protect and preserve tribal sovereignty, but also promote and protect rights to gather, manage traditional plants, and enhance the opportunities for tribes to be able to enter conservation programs like EQIP. So with that, I think we're going to head on to traditional foods, and I want to hand it off to Janie Sumstep.
Thanks, Colby. Maria, could you take us to the next slide? And for those of you who know me, you know that I could probably take up at least 3 or 4 hours on any kind of webinar talking about traditional foods. But I didn't want to do that today because the conservation and forestry provisions of the Farm Bill are so terribly important, not just for traditional foods, but on their own. So traditional foods can be impacted by many of the Farm Bill titles. If you listen to what Colby did walking through, you can readily see that the conservation and forestry titles have some extremely important parts of those particular authorized programs that are important to traditional foods protection. Many tribes use the existing authorities within the conservation title and the forestry title to work on issues related to habitat, related to protection of traditional foods, regardless of what those might be. In Alaska, we see that it's especially necessary with regard to protecting traditional and customary lifeways, natural resources, and animal health and protection around subsistence practices. But it isn't just in Alaska, it is in the lower 48 as well. In all areas of Indian country, natural resources and animal health and wildlife health and protection are essential to the protection of traditional foods. But food sovereignty activities, which many of you who are on this phone call know are just going full steam ahead all over Indian country, involve traditional foods, and they can be found, the funding streams for traditional foods and food sovereignty activities can be found in at least half or more of the titles of the Farm Bill. Next slide, please. Here's just one example. We actually have multiple previous farm bills that have authorized the purchasing of traditional foods for feeding programs, such as the Food Distribution on Indian Reservation program. That existed several farm bills ago. The most recent farm bill had multiple references to traditional foods, but one in particular was Section 4033 that allowed traditional foods to be donated into residential child care facilities, child nutrition programs, and other public settings within Indian country. That particular section of the law defined traditional foods, but it also contains some sections that released from liability those who might be donating the food. But it also called for USDA and FDA to require service of these foods if certain food safety measures are met, which should give you a signal as to the importance and the emerging importance of food safety issues with regard to traditional foods, which really should be the subject of a future webinar. There have been demonstration projects, particularly in FDIPR, which is the Food Distribution Program. Authorization for purchasing of traditional foods has existed for some time, and to their credit, USDA through Food and Nutrition Service and Ag Marketing Service have improved quite dramatically their purchasing of traditional foods over time. But as in anything, particularly in this environment, we must do our best to try to make sure that our partners in USDA FNS keep up that purchasing of traditional foods. Next slide, please. This slide actually can show you, I'm not going to read it to you, but it can show you how the funding of traditional foods, and I would say, and more broadly speaking, food sovereignty efforts can literally exist across the entirety of the titles themselves. I have also, in addition to the horticulture title, the forestry, the nutrition title, the trade title, the conservation title, and the commodities title, I've actually seen funding for traditional foods as well as food sovereignty projects in the research title. I've seen it in the rural development title as well. So there's multiple ways that the current authorities at USDA have been used to bring resources to the growing amount of food sovereignty and traditional foods work that is happening in Indian country. Again, we could go into much more minute detail around these issues, but we wanted to give you a glimpse of how important the Farm Bill is, even to the issue of traditional foods and food sovereignty. Next slide. And I think, Maria, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Janie. And now is the time for discussions and questions. There was one question that came through our system, and someone wanted to know if, does it have to be a tribe to join the coalition, or can a tribal organization join? And the answer to that question is yes, of course a tribal organization can join the coalition. We're welcoming any tribal organizations, regional tribal organizations, intertribals who have an interest in the Farm Bill to join our coalition. And again, how you can join the coalition is by submitting a resolution and emailing it to info@nativefarmbillcoalition.org. And if anyone participating has a question that has not been answered on the webinar, now is your time to submit it through the webinar. We just got a question in. Someone wants to know, where does fish hatcheries sit Colby, do you have any information about fish hatcheries in the Farm Bill?
Maria?
Our next question is, where do fish hatcheries sit in the Farm Bill? Do any of our coalition partners have any answers?
Yeah, while Colby is finding the unmute button, let me just add, this is Phil Bakershank. USDA, through its research service, ARS, does actively support what they call aquaculture. That obviously includes hatcheries, although fish hatcheries by definition typically refer to, perhaps most familiar are salmon hatcheries, but there are others, obviously. But there's a lot of interaction between the USDA Aquaculture, ARS, or Agricultural Research Service, and Fish and Wildlife at Interior around hatchery. So there are significant grants and both those and extension agents who work with hatcheries. I think in the Regaining Our Future volume, there is some reference to the production of fish, and which obviously would include hatchery for the young.
Phil?
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Janie. Sorry, we temporarily lost connection. But Phil is exactly right. But it is exactly as I just discussed in the traditional foods arena. You can literally go within many of the existing authorities and titles of the Farm Bill and actually cabbage together, so to speak, support for hatcheries. However, it is one of those areas that we literally could see some really important new language emerging in this Farm Bill that would clarify for moving forward that hatcheries clearly are within the jurisdiction and authority of the Farm Bill itself. Whenever you bring the fisheries onto land in order to actually package, manufacture, do value added, et cetera, with those foods and prepare them for any kind of use within the tribe or marketing, that is clearly within authority, but it is one of those areas that we could definitely use some manager's language or some clarification that would give USDA more signals in the hatcheries arena.
Let me just add, this is a highly politicized area, federal funding for fish aquaculture, and we're late to that party. So what's left are crumbs, and in that context, our argument is parity. Our being Indian country's argument is parity and a fair share, an allocation, some sort of pro rata division of that money. It's going to be an uphill battle, but this is not unlike some of the other areas of the Farm Bill where we've been bypassed and ignored and overlooked, and the outcomes of that are a lack of development in Indian country. And so our argument is a moral and legal one to catch up and give us a fair share or a parity share of these dollars.
Thanks, Phil. Our next question comes from Danae Wilson from the Nez Perce tribe. Will this have any impacts on telecom funding, both on grants and on loan programs? And Danae knows I work on telecom, and this will have an impact. We'll be covering the rural development title of the Farm Bill on our next webinar. The funding and the authorizations, the authorizations for the rural utility service and the grants and loans that come from the rural utility service are within that rural development title. So this the Farm Bill will have the opportunity to change some of these authorizations. And Danae, we can talk further about that, about how from a tribal telecom perspective, how we can approach the Farm Bill as well. Our next question is, what is the possibility of including Alaska reindeer as an amenable species along with cattle? Colby and Janie?
Yeah, we actually have, if you look at the very front part of the first title of the Regaining Our Future report, it actually includes as additional language that we're proposing caribou to be included as an identified species. When you get into amenable versus non-amenable, that becomes a whole different conversation with regard to food safety and inspection, and it literally warrants another entire conversation. But we did pick up, and we heard it from many folks for a long period of time, that reindeer, caribou, and some of those other species should be included in the commodities title. Amenable versus non-amenable is identified in the report as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about feral horses. Is there a read on feral horse issues being included in this farm bill? Does anyone know much about this issue?
Can you repeat the question, Maria?
What is your read on feral horses issues being included in this farm bill?
Sure.
This is Phil. The wild horses debate does, of course, impact Indian country in some locations, but I'm not sure that I have seen anything in our effort that is focused on getting Indian country resources out of the USDA responsibility and interior responsibility for feral horses.
If I can add a little bit to that too. I think that's right. Particularly when you're talking about managing some of the feral horses and wild horses issues, a lot of that falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior, as a lot of that ends up being on land that they end up managing at the end of the day. Some of the other issues that does come up with particularly horses at USDA can be the processing of horses. That's something that is actually, it ends up being an appropriations issue, because almost every single approach bill that's come out since I can remember off the top of my head always includes language that does not allow the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is the authority that oversees and regulates food processing and animal slaughter facilities, to use their money for any facility that processes horses. So that's something else that comes up in the feral horse context. So for that to be addressed in the Farm Bill, I don't think we'll see happen, but that does end up coming up in the appropriations process. But to be able to address some of the other issues, you probably would need to go through some of the different other authorities, which would be like the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and the other authorities that exist for BLM and the Department of the Interior.
Great, thank you, Colby. Our next question is a really good one. What are the key ways in which the Farm Bill directly implicates Native American youth? And I know that there has been a big effort on Native youth in the Farm Bill by the Intertribal Ag Council, as well as the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Janie or Ross?
Ross?
Go ahead.
Ross, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Janie.
Sorry, our system here is not doing so well today. Both Intertribal Ag Council and the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative have been involved for several years on Native youth and food and agriculture issues, and Ross can go into more detail about what their work has been. But I can tell you that there, for instance, the summit that we hold here every year has been funded, not every year, but for 3 years has been funded not fully, but partially by a Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program grant. And so NRCS has some financial resources. FSA, Farm Service Agency, has some financial resources. There are literally and multiple funding authorities at in the research title can focus on beginning farmers and ranchers and native youth. So, fighting for the presence of those and maintaining the presence of those, particularly when we're in a generational shift in agriculture, is just extremely important. So, Ross, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, there's funding available through FSA, youth loans, the short-term FSA equity type loans. There's numerous opportunities for youth to get involved, and we include youth in every one of our efforts to ensure Indian access to these programs, that our youth have an equitable opportunity.
Great, thank you. One of our questions is, besides the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, who are our champions for looking out for Indian country in this farm bill? And, I think I'd like to answer this one. I think the Indian country needs to be turning everyone into an advocate and a champion for Indian country on this one. We need to be looking outside of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and the House Natural Resources Committee, and looking to the agriculture committees of both the House and the Senate. They're going to be writing the main bills of this. And if we only focus our efforts outside of that, we may get left out. So I'd like to ask everyone on this call to, ask if their member of Congress is on one of the agriculture committees, and if they are, definitely reach out and start talking to them and start building that relationship to help them realize how big this bill is and how big of an impact it can have on your communities. There's another great question. Is there anything in this farm bill that addresses housing? I know that IFAI might have an answer to this one about housing in the farm bill.
Yes, Maria, we're going to take that up. We will take that up in the rural development discussion for our next webinar. But yes, Rural Housing Service is one of the agencies that is a part of USDA rural development, so it will be taken up there. But there is a substantial portfolio in rural development around housing issues, as well as business and industry, as well as rural infrastructure and utilities. We'll get to that on the next webinar, but yes.
Great, thanks. Sounds like people might be interested in our next webinar that's happening on January 29th, covering economic development, credit, rural development, and research. Telecommunications and housing will be covered in that webinar. And our next question, gosh, we're getting a lot of them all at one time. I think our next question is, where does hemp fall into this bill? I know there was mention of it in the miscellaneous title. Does IFAI have any more information about hemp in the miscellaneous title?
Right now, hemp in the last farm bill has had a growing amount of attention, if you will. Not just within Indian country, but with a lot of producers around the country, as one of those new areas that could be quite an important economic diversification tool for farming and ranching communities. But hemp is one of those areas where the Congress has chosen to go extremely slow and has focused first and foremost on the research components of hemp. and has pretty strictly controlled how and what kinds of research institutions can even be involved in the hemp focus. And so this is an area that we identified in the actual report itself, Regaining Our Future report, as an area that there is obviously a lot of interest in Indian country around it, but it is one of those areas that we aren't by ourselves in that arena, and just understanding what the full scope of and possibilities are in an industrial hemp marketplace and making the case would be an important thing for us to consider pushing forward. But I would imagine that Indian country's efforts in hemp literally would be sitting alongside non-native players, because there are a substantial number of them wishing to open up that market. Right now, there's not a lot in the Farm Bill itself because Congress has chosen to move slow.
That's a great answer, Janie. Thank you. I'm cognizant of time. We're 5 minutes over. The last question, I think, is a great segue into wrapping this up. Someone wants to know if they can get a copy of the presentation, and I will be sending out an email to all of the webinar participants with a copy of this presentation, some one-pagers that we've been working on that you can share with your congressional offices, as well as the Regaining Our Future report that details all of this really well, and we'll be sending that out most likely tomorrow. And in addition, we'll have the YouTube link ready for this presentation in case someone missed it or in case you'd like to share it with some of your colleagues. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide, which is how you can get involved. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved, but I think the first one, as far as the Native Farm Bill Coalition is concerned, is to pass a tribal resolution to join the coalition. Ask your tribal leaders to participate in this, and make sure that that resolution gets sent to info@nativefarmbillcoalition.org. And also, if you go through the Regaining Our Future report in the one-pagers, if you identify ones that are really going to impact your tribe, we want to know what's happening on the local level for your community, and what's going to be, what the opportunities are and what you really think is going to impact your community. So if you can send those recommendations to the same email, info@nativefarmbillcoalition.org, that would be great. And like we mentioned in the congressional update, there is going to be a hearing on the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and they will be taking testimony until January 31st. This is possibly our only chance to get Indian country's voice heard in the record for Congress about this issue. So you can send that to testimony@indian.senate.gov. And we found that with a lot of these federal comments, it's great to put it on tribal letterhead so that the person receiving that testimony knows that it is the tribe that's submitting this. So again, submit that by January 31st. And then, become an advocate yourself. Call and meet with your members of Congress on the Farm Bill. Tell them what your priorities are. And if you're having some trouble finding your priorities, we can help you with that. We can walk you through some of these things and help you identify what's going to really impact your community. And especially if you have, if your member of Congress is on one of the agriculture committees, hearing from one tribe could help multiple tribes, all 500 tribes out in the country. And then as a member of NCAI, I'd like to personally invite you to the Executive Council Winter Session. We're having that in Washington, D.C. from February 12th through the 15th. We're going to be having a Farm Bill session during that conference. And during that time, we also have days set aside for folks to go up to the Hill and to meet with their members of Congress. This is going to be a really good time strategically for where the bill is going to talk to your member of Congress at the right time where they can actually make some edits and put some good things in the bill. So there's a lot happening, and it's happening really quick here in the new year. So we hope that you stay involved in the coalition and talk to us, email us, and just keep pressing your members of Congress. This is it's the Farm Bill, so that means it's in Congress, and so we really need to make our voices heard because these members of Congress work for us, so we're their bosses. So on that, I'd just like to invite you to our next webinar, January 29th on 2018. Again, it'll focus on economic development, credit, rural development, and research. So the questions about housing and about telecommunications will be handled in our next webinar. So definitely join us. We'll be at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern on January 29th. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining, and we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar. Thank you.